The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. Every eye was fixed on the woman standing tall at the center of it all, her presence commanding, her voice steady, but her eyes burning with a fire that no one could ignore. She was a black woman, dressed in a sharp blazer, her hair neatly styled, and her posture unshaken even as the uniformed officer approached her with a stern expression. "Ma'am, you need to leave," he said, his tone firm, almost dismissive, but she didn't move. Not an inch. Instead, she looked him straight in the eye and said, "I have every right to be here." The tension in the room was palpable, like a storm brewing just beneath the surface. No one knew who she was or why she was there. But one thing was clear. This wasn't going to end quietly. The officer hesitated, his hand hovering near his radio as if unsure of what to do next. The judge, an older man with a face etched with years of authority, leaned forward, his voice booming across the room. "Officer, escort her out. Now." The command was clear, but the woman didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper, holding it up for everyone to see. "Before you do that," she said, her voice calm but laced with something sharper, "you might want to take a look at this." The room froze. What was on that paper? Who was this woman? And why did it feel like the entire course of this day, and maybe even the lives of everyone in that room, was about to change? Before anyone could react, the officer's radio crackled to life. A voice came through, urgent and unmistakably official. "Stand down. I repeat, stand down. Do not remove her from the courtroom." The officer's face went pale, his hand trembling as he lowered the radio. The judge's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting from the officer to the woman, who now wore a small, knowing smile. "What's going on here?" the judge demanded, his voice rising. But before anyone could answer, the courtroom doors burst open, and a man in a dark suit rushed in, holding a phone. "Your Honor," he said out of breath, "you need to take this call. It's from the White House." The room erupted into whispers, the tension now electric. The woman stood still, her expression unreadable, as the judge reluctantly took the phone. His face went through a series of emotions: confusion, shock, and finally, something that looked a lot like fear. He hung up the phone and stared at the woman, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you?" he asked. She didn't answer right away, letting the question hang in the air like a thunderclap. Instead, she turned to the officer, who was now visibly shaken, and said, "I think it's time you sat down." The officer, without a word, obeyed. The judge, still reeling, sank back into his chair. And the woman, she took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the room, as if she knew this was only the beginning. But what happened next? Who was this woman? And why did a call from the White House stop everything in its tracks? What was on that piece of paper she held so confidently? And most importantly, what did this mean for the case that was supposed to be heard today? A case that, until this moment, seemed like just another day in court. The answers were coming, but not yet. For now, the room was left in stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over everyone like a thick fog. And as the woman finally spoke, her words cut through the tension like a knife. "Let's begin," she said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet power that no one could ignore. The storm had arrived, and there was no turning back. The woman's voice echoed through the courtroom, calm yet commanding, as if she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. "Let's begin," she said again, her eyes locking onto the judge's. The room was still reeling, the air thick with unanswered questions. Who was she? What was her connection to the White House? And why did her presence feel like a seismic shift in the very foundation of the case being heard today? The judge, still visibly shaken, cleared his throat and nodded, though his usual air of authority seemed to have evaporated. "Proceed," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor, each step deliberate and measured. She introduced herself as Attorney Naomi Carter, a name that sent a ripple through the room. Some recognized it immediately. Her reputation preceded her. Naomi Carter wasn't just any lawyer. She was a powerhouse, known for taking on high-stakes cases that others wouldn't touch. She had a track record of winning against impossible odds, often representing the underrepresented, the forgotten, the silenced. But what was she doing here, in this small-town courtroom, on a case that had barely made the local news? The case itself seemed straightforward at first glance. A young black man, Marcus Johnson, was on trial for a crime he swore he didn't commit. The charges were serious: armed robbery and assault, and the evidence against him, at least on the surface, appeared damning. Security footage, eyewitness testimony, and a partial fingerprint at the scene had all been presented by the prosecution. Marcus had been sitting in the defendant's chair, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow, as if he had already accepted his fate. But now, with Naomi Carter in the room, something shifted. The energy changed. Marcus sat up a little straighter, his eyes flickering with something that hadn't been there before. Hope. Naomi began to speak, her voice steady but filled with an intensity that demanded attention. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the court, what you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about this case. This isn't just about Marcus Johnson. This is about justice. This is about truth. And this is about a system that has failed too many people for far too long. She paused, letting her words sink in, before turning to the judge. I request a brief recess to present new evidence. Evidence that will not only exonerate my client, but also expose a much larger story. One that goes beyond this courtroom. The judge hesitated, his eyes darting to the prosecutor, who looked equally stunned. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man named Robert Hayes, stood up abruptly. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We've already presented our case. The defense had their opportunity. This is nothing but a stunt to delay the renfro. His voice was sharp, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes as if he sensed that the ground was shifting beneath him. Naomi didn't flinch. With all due respect, Mr. Hayes, justice isn't about sticking to a schedule. It's about getting it right. And if you're so confident in your case, then you should have no problem with a short recess to review this evidence. She held up the piece of paper again, the same one she had shown earlier. And this time, the judge leaned forward, his curiosity outweighing his reluctance. Very well, he said after a long pause. We'll take a 30-minute recess. But Ms. Carter, this had better be worth it. As the courtroom emptied, the buzz of conversation grew louder. Reporters, who had been dozing off just moments ago, were now frantically typing on their phones, trying to piece together what had just happened. Spectators whispered to each other, their eyes darting between Naomi, Marcus, and the judge's empty seat. Outside the courtroom, Naomi pulled Marcus aside, her expression softening for the first time since she had entered. Marcus, she said, her voice low but firm. I need you to trust me. What's about to happen isn't just about your case. It's about something much bigger. But I need you to stay strong, no matter what. Marcus nodded, though his eyes were wide with fear and confusion. I don't understand, he said quietly. Why is the White House involved? What's going on? Naomi hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully. I can't explain everything right now, she said. But what I can tell you is this. You're not alone anymore. And this fight isn't just about you. It's about everyone who's been wronged by a system that's supposed to protect them. She placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of reassurance, before turning to her team, who were waiting with a stack of files and a laptop. Meanwhile, in the judge's chambers, the tension was even thicker. The judge, the prosecutor, and a few court officials had gathered around a small table, their faces grim. The call from the White House had been brief but chilling. "Do not interfere," the voice on the other end had said. "Let her present her case. No explanation. No details. Just a command that left everyone in the room uneasy." The judge rubbed his temples, his mind racing. What had he gotten himself into? And what was in that evidence Naomi Carter was so confident about? Back in the courtroom, the 30 minutes felt like an eternity. When the judge finally returned, his face was unreadable, but his hands trembled slightly as he took his seat. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice strained, "you may proceed." Naomi stood, her confidence unwavering, and approached the bench. "Thank you, Your Honor. What I'm about to show you will change everything." She handed the piece of paper to the judge, who scanned it quickly, his eyes widening as he read. The prosecutor, unable to contain his curiosity, leaned over to look, but the judge held up a hand to stop him. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice tight, "you might want to sit down for this." The room fell silent again, the suspense almost unbearable. Naomi turned to face the courtroom, her expression solemn but determined. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "what you're about to see is evidence of a cover-up. A cover-up that goes far beyond this case. It involves corruption, abuse of power, and a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of government. And at the center of it all is Marcus Johnson, a young man who was set up to take the fall for crimes he didn't commit." The gasps in the room were audible, but Naomi wasn't finished. She clicked a button on her laptop, and a video began to play on the courtroom screen. The footage was grainy, but the images were clear enough to send shockwaves through the room. It showed a meeting, a secret meeting, between high-ranking officials, including someone who looked eerily familiar. The prosecutor's face went pale as he recognized one of the figures on the screen. This is impossible," he stammered, but Naomi cut him off. "It's very possible," she said, her voice steady. "And it's just the beginning." She turned back to the judge, her eyes blazing. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss all charges against Marcus Johnson immediately, and I demand a full investigation into the individuals involved in this conspiracy." The judge stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and dread. The room was in chaos, reporters scrambling to capture every word, spectators whispering in shock, and Marcus sitting in stunned silence, his future hanging in the balance. But as the judge opened his mouth to respond, a loud knock echoed through the courtroom. Everyone turned to see two federal agents standing at the door, their expressions grim. "Your Honor," one of them said, "we need to speak with you." Immediately, the judge hesitated, his eyes darting between Naomi, the agents, and the still-playing video on the screen. The tension in the room was at a breaking point, and no one knew what would happen next. One thing was certain: this wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a reckoning, and the storm was far from over.